There's something about the open road at night that gives you a false sense of freedom, but also leaves you vulnerable to whatever lurks in the shadows. It's easy to feel invincible, surrounded by nothing but asphalt and sky, but the road can quickly turn against you. Some places were never meant to be traveled, and some paths should have been forgotten long ago. Stephen, a seasoned trucker, had been driving cross-country for years, often taking shortcuts to shave off time. That's how he found the old, weather-beaten sign pointing to a road less traveled, a road that led through an abandoned tunnel. His GPS wasn't working in this remote area, but he figured the detour would save him hours of driving. It was just a tunnel after all. As he turned off the main highway, the road became narrower, the pavement more cracked and uneven. Trees lined the road, their branches bending toward the truck like skeletal hands. The farther he drove, the thicker the fog became, creeping across the asphalt like something alive. Then he saw it, the entrance to the tunnel. Its once grand arch was now crumbling, covered in vines and graffiti, the darkness inside impenetrable. Stephen hesitated for a moment, feeling a cold shiver run down his spine, but he shook it off. He'd driven through worse. He wasn't going to let some old, forgotten tunnel spook him. He switched on his high beams and slowly entered. The tunnel swallowed the light almost immediately, leaving only a narrow path visible in front of him. The sound of his engine echoed off the stone walls, and the air grew cold, thick with dampness. Stephen's hands tightened on the wheel as he drove deeper into the darkness. Minutes passed, and the tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly. He checked the clock, frowning. It didn't make sense. The tunnel shouldn't have been this long. His headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw movement in the rearview mirror, something shifting in the shadows. His heart raced, and he tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light. But then he saw it again, clearer this time. A figure, dark and indistinct, was walking behind the truck, keeping pace with him. Panic gripped him, and he pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck surged forward. But no matter how fast he went, the figure remained in the shadows, just on the edge of his vision. It wasn't running. It was walking. Slowly, steadily, always keeping up. The tunnel walls seemed to close in on him, the darkness becoming suffocating. Stephen's breath quickened, and he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The figure was getting closer, its outline clearer now. It looked human, but there was something off, something unnatural about the way it moved. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, blasting static through the speakers. Stephen jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't touched the radio, and there were no stations out here. The static grew louder, almost deafening, and then he heard it, a low, whispering voice, garbled but unmistakable. It was saying his name. Stephen's blood ran cold. He slammed his hand on the dashboard, trying to shut off the radio, but the whispering continued, growing more urgent, more insistent. He turned the volume knob, but it did nothing. The voice was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond the radio. And then the truck's engine sputtered. The lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely, plunging him into total darkness. The truck rolled to a stop, and the whispering stopped with it. The tunnel was silent. Too silent. Stephen sat frozen, listening to the sound of his own rapid breathing. He could feel it now. Something was behind him. He didn't dare look, didn't dare move, but the presence was undeniable. Cold, malevolent, and watching him. Summoning every ounce of courage, Stephen reached for the ignition, his hand trembling. He turned the key, and the engine roared back to life. The lights flickered on, and for a brief moment, the figure stood directly behind the truck, its face hidden in shadow, its presence overwhelming. He slammed on the gas, tires screeching as the truck lurched forward. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness growing thicker, heavier. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The figure was still there. Just as he thought he would never escape, the tunnel's exit appeared in the distance, a faint glimmer of light in the suffocating blackness. He pushed the truck harder, speeding toward the light, desperate to break free of the nightmare that had taken hold of him. The truck shot out of the tunnel, skidding to a stop on the gravel road outside. Stephen gasped for breath, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. The tunnel loomed behind him, dark and silent, as if it had never been there. But the feeling didn't leave him. The cold, the presence, the figure, it had followed him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the dark figure standing in the distance, but there was nothing. Yet, the whispering hadn't stopped. Let me tell you a story about a stretch of road that no trucker dares to talk about, a road where whispers of lost souls are carried by the wind, and where truckers mysteriously vanish, never completing their journeys. It's called Highway 66, a desolate, forgotten road that winds through miles of barren land. And tonight, one man is about to discover why this highway is avoided at all costs. Justin was an experienced truck driver, accustomed to long hauls through the night. He'd driven across states, seen empty roads stretch for miles, and encountered all sorts of strange sights on his journeys, but nothing ever truly scared him. Until now. One night, as Justin's GPS inexplicably lost signal, he found himself rerouted onto Highway 66, a road he hadn't driven before. The highway was quiet, too quiet, with no sign of life except for the faint glow of his headlights on the pavement. The farther he drove, the more isolated he felt, as if the road itself was pulling him into some dark, forgotten place. The eerie silence was unsettling, but he brushed it off. He told himself it was just another lonely road, nothing more. But then his radio crackled to life. Static at first, but slowly a faint voice broke through. It sounded like a man's voice, distant but clear enough to make out one word: turn back. Justin's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The voice vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him with nothing but the hum of the engine and the oppressive quiet of the road. He glanced at the passenger seat where his radio sat. It wasn't even on. Chills crept down his spine. He tried to shake off the unease that had settled over him. But as he continued down the highway, the air inside the cab grew colder. His breath started to fog up the windshield, and his headlights seemed to dim, as though something was draining the light from them. Up ahead, Justin saw a figure standing on the side of the road. A hitchhiker, maybe. He slowed the truck, his curiosity piqued, but as he got closer, the figure disappeared into thin air. No footprints, no sign of life, just an empty road stretching on forever. His heart raced as his mind struggled to make sense of what he'd just seen. He told himself it must have been a trick of the light. But deep down, he knew there was something wrong with this place. Minutes passed, and the road seemed endless, looping in on itself, as if he wasn't making any progress. Then the radio crackled again, louder this time, the voice more urgent. "They're coming," it whispered. Justin's pulse quickened. He glanced at the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he noticed something. Faint shadows moving along the horizon behind him. They were barely visible, like mist creeping closer, but they were there, and they were gaining on him. He floored the gas pedal, the truck roaring as it sped down the highway. But no matter how fast he went, the shadows kept closing in, swirling like a storm of dark shapes. Suddenly, his headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered as if it was struggling to stay alive. Justin's panic grew. The road ahead was dark, almost as if the highway itself was disappearing into a black void. And then, in the distance, he saw them. Figures standing on the side of the road, pale and unmoving. They were truckers, their eyes hollow, faces twisted with anguish, like they had been trapped here for eternity. Their trucks were parked on the shoulder, rusted and abandoned, long forgotten. Justin's truck jerked, as if something invisible was pulling at it. He slammed the brakes, bringing the rig to a screeching halt, but the shadows were everywhere now, surrounding him, clawing at the cab. The air inside the truck grew suffocatingly cold. He could hear them now, the whispers of the lost truckers, their voices begging for help, for release from the eternal torment of Highway 66. He threw open the door, desperate to escape, but as soon as he stepped out, the ground beneath him shifted, and he felt the pull of something dark and ancient. The figures surrounded him, their ghostly hands reaching out, dragging him toward the rusted remains of their trucks. Justin screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the endless stretch of Highway 66 and the shadows of the truckers who would never complete their journeys. The next morning, his truck was found abandoned on the side of the road, engine still running, but no sign of Justin anywhere. The police chalked it up to an accident, but the locals knew the truth. They said that once you set foot on Highway 66, you're as good as gone. That the spirits of the lost truckers are always watching, waiting for their next victim to join them on their eternal journey. Let me tell you about the night when a seasoned trucker named Samuel encountered something that still haunts him to this day. Have you ever had that feeling where something is watching you, lurking just out of sight? That gnawing sense of dread you can't quite shake? Well, Samuel experienced it in the worst way possible. This wasn't just a trick of the mind. What he saw was real, and it was getting closer every minute. It all started on an empty stretch of Highway 66. Samuel had been trucking for nearly 2 decades, hauling freight across the country, mostly at night when the roads were quiet. He preferred it that way, no traffic, just the hum of his engine and the miles rolling by. But on this particular night, the silence felt wrong. There was an unsettling heaviness in the air, a quiet that gnawed at the edges of his nerves. Around midnight, he first noticed the eyes. In his rearview mirror, just above the horizon, 2 glowing orbs were staring back at him. He blinked, thinking they were the headlights of a car far behind, but something about their brightness was off. They were too high, too focused, almost like they were watching him. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. Samuel told himself he was just tired, that his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had a long haul ahead and didn't have time to be spooked by imaginary things. He cranked up the radio, hoping the noise would fill the growing void in his chest, but it didn't help. The quiet between the songs felt oppressive, pressing in on him like a weight. Then, as he rounded a bend in the highway, the eyes returned. This time, they were closer. They hung in the darkness like glowing embers, just far enough back to remain unnerving. Samuel squinted into the mirror, trying to get a better look, but as soon as he focused on them, they disappeared. A chill crept up his spine. Something was following him, something that wasn't a car or any living creature he knew. His heart began to pound, though he kept telling himself it was nothing. But deep down, Samuel knew this stretch of highway had its share of stories. Stories of truckers disappearing, their rigs found abandoned on the roadside with no sign of where they went or what happened to them. As the miles pass, the eyes continue to come and go, always getting closer. Samuel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his palms slick with sweat. He adjusted the mirror, trying to make sure it wasn't just a reflection or a trick of the light, but the eyes were unmistakable. They glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and the more he looked, the more he felt them pulling at him, like they wanted something from him. He sped up, pushing his rig faster than he usually would on such an empty road, but no matter how fast he went, the eyes followed. They blinked in and out of view, each time closer than the last, each time filling him with more dread. It was as if they were playing a game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered, and the headlights dimmed, casting long, wavering shadows across the road. Panic surged through Samuel's veins. He knew he couldn't stop. Not here, not with whatever was out there watching him. He pumped the gas pedal, willing the engine to come back to life, but it was no use. The truck groaned and slowed to a crawl, the headlights barely illuminating the road ahead. As the truck rolled to a stop, Samuel's heart raced in his chest. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, his breath catching in his throat as the eyes appeared once more, closer than ever before. They weren't just eyes anymore. In the dim light, Samuel could see the faint outline of a figure tall and shadowy, with long twisted limbs that seemed to stretch toward him. His blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. It stood at the edge of the darkness, watching, waiting. Desperate, Samuel fumbled with the door handle, nearly ripping it off in his panic. He stumbled out of the truck, his boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud. The air was icy, and the wind howled through the open road, but there was no other sound, just silence and the pounding of his own heartbeat. He looked around frantically, but there was no one. The road stretched out in both directions, empty and desolate. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Samuel felt it deep in his bones. The presence hadn't left. It was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. The truck stop was only a few miles ahead, but it felt like an eternity away. He knew he couldn't walk there, not with whatever was out here with him. He had to get back in the truck. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to climb back into the cab, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. But as he closed the door, the eyes appeared again in the rearview mirror, this time directly behind him. They were so close he could see the faint outline of a face, pale and twisted, with empty sockets where the eyes should have been. Samuel's breath hitched in his throat. He slammed the truck into gear, praying it would start. The engine roared to life, and Samuel floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, but the eyes didn't disappear this time. They followed him, keeping pace with the truck, always just a few feet behind. Samuel drove as fast as he could, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but no matter how fast he went, the eyes stayed with him. The figure was getting closer, its presence growing stronger with every mile. By the time he reached the truck stop, Samuel was drenched in sweat, his hands shaking as he pulled into the parking lot. He jumped out of the cab, not daring to look back, and ran inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The clerk behind the counter looked up as Samuel burst through the door, his face pale and drawn. He had heard the stories before, but no one ever believed them, until now.